There's a few of us, before church starts, we gather in the kitchen, some of us talk and drink coffee. And one of the topics we were talking about was houses and the upkeep of the house. And it's very interesting. We talked about that conversation when I'm talking about a little bit of that on my lead up at the very beginning of my sermon. Very interesting. I wish that I liked to clean more. I really do really so wish. You see, being a working mom to an active 2-year-old toddler, boy, very much a boy, and a wife to a band director who works many long hours and not normal hours, it makes it difficult for me to keep up with cleaning. But if I'm being completely honest, that's not the real reason why I don't clean up around the house more. You see, I'm a person who just gravitates towards having piles of clutter. We all know. There are people like that, and I'm one of them. It's not that I'm against throwing away things. It's just that I set things down and I forget about them, and then one day I look around and I see my piles and think, you know what, Melinda, we probably ought to do something about those piles of clutter. And then, so I do. Now, after those times when I do clean up, I immediately feel so much better. I just do, and feel so much lighter. I think you guys know what I mean by that. After I clean up, it's as if a weight has been lifted. And I think that the same could be said about spiritually cleaning up the piles of stuff that we have in our lives and how freeing that can really be. Our scripture passage today has something to say about spiritually cleaning up our lives so that we can be prepared for what is to come. Our scripture today is located in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is most likely the first gospel that was penned to paper. It's widely believed that by Bible scholars, the authors of both the Gospel of Matthew and Luke's Gospel used Mark's resource, along with other documents, to write their own particular Gospels. It's debated among scholars whether the author of the Gospel of John used Mark's Gospel as a reference to write his own, or if John just totally disregarded it. You often find that when more than one Gospel talks about the same story, Mark's version of that particular story is usually pared down compared to the other Gospels, and they're telling that same story. You'll find more embellishments and detail out of the stories of Matthew, Luke, and John than you will in Mark for the most part. There are exceptions, of course. And there's a great explanation for why that is so. A lot of it has to do because Mark's Gospel was written first. So Mark didn't have a lot of time to marinate over the stories as much as the authors of the other Gospels did later. We know that once a story is told over and over again by many different people over the course of time, the original story can kind of take on a life of its own. It's similar to a giant game of telephone. What starts off as a simple story about Uncle Bob going to the grocery store and spraining his ankle in a parking lot somehow, over the course of time, turns into Uncle Bob and Aunt Mary getting in a car accident outside the grocery store, with Uncle Bob having a broken leg. Sometimes things take on a life of their own after the course of time. Our scripture today is located in Mark's first 8 verses. Mark's gospel starts very abruptly, as Rain said, and it starts out without really much of an introduction, as the first line of this gospel reads, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." This line is very simplistic, without really much pizzazz, but it most definitely sets the tone for what is to come. After that introductory line telling us that we are to hear some good news about Jesus, we are confronted with a prophecy from the prophet Isaiah. It's a prophecy about a messenger whose role is to prepare others for the coming of the Lord, the Messiah. Messiah, the messenger, as we know, and as Mark points out, is John. We know him as John the Baptist. The Gospel of Mark does not tell us a lot of information about John the Baptist, and none of the Gospels really do. What we do know is that John and Jesus were cousins. They were born around the same time, so they most likely grew up together. For the most part, the Gospels are silent about Jesus' childhood, so we don't know what kind of relationship that John and Jesus really had. Were they close? Did they like each other? How well did they know each other? Did Jesus and John at an early age know their specific roles and tasks that God had given them? While we don't know much about their childhoods, we know much more about their adult years. What we do know is that John the Baptist was rough around the edges, so to speak. Mark writes that John the Baptist appears out of the wilderness. But John might have actually come out of the wilderness in the most literal sense. Or perhaps Mark is alluding to something less literal and more symbolic. Throughout both the New and the Old Testament, the image of a wilderness is used to signify a period of wandering and uncertainty. So quite possibly John did not literally come out of the wilderness. Instead, Mark could possibly be alluding to John's arrival occurring after a dry spell. After a significant period of time when God's people were searching and praying for God's presence and love to more fully and deeply be present amongst them. God's arrival and message, in a very real, concrete way, ushered in a new period of time for God's people. Our scripture in Mark says there's a crowd that gathers around John the Baptist, and not only gathers around him to hear what he has to say, they also want to confess their sins and be baptized by John. It's a mini miracle in and of itself that anyone is attracted to John, as he's clothed in camel's hair, wears a leather belt, and eats a diet of locusts and wild honey. Just goes to show you that God can work through and with anyone. Who John the Baptist is and what he does is so very important, but he's also very quick to point out that there's someone more powerful than him. John is just the opening act for Jesus, so to speak. Jesus has a much more important role than John does. Jesus is so much more special than John. John is not even worthy enough to untie Jesus' sandals. John has a very specific role. He is not the Messiah, but Jesus is. John the Baptist is so very crucial to Jesus' story. In Mark's Gospel, John is the one who prepares the way for the Lord. And in a very real way, he's a prophet. A prophet's role is sometimes believed to be one who predicts the future, but really that's not what a prophet does. Instead, a prophet receives and conveys a message from God that is directed towards a certain group of people. And almost 100% of the time, the prophet's message is very uncomfortable to hear. Because the prophet warns, because God through the prophet confronts sin on both the individual level and also a corporate level, sin that happens within a group of people. The prophet warns that if the sin and the wrongdoing doesn't stop, and if the people don't turn back to God, then something really bad will happen. In other words, the people better shape up, or in a way, they're toast. Instead of a prophet being a fortune teller, a prophet is more of a truth teller. John the Baptist's responsibility was to tell those who would listen, to clear out their lies, the junk, the mess, the sin, so that they would be able to recognize Jesus as the Messiah when they saw him. But in order for them to see Jesus more fully, It had to be